Okay, welcome to the next in the series of the Transforming Assessment webinars. Today's session by Worrall is e-assessment in the VET sector, and she'll be talking about the guidelines and the e-assessment guidelines that the VET sector has set up. Melanie is from the Klevar group, and she formerly worked for the Australian Flexible Learning Framework, and that was the organisation that she was working for when I met her in, I think it must have been the URBA conference in Adelaide a couple of years ago. So today what we're going to do is Melanie will run through her session. As I mentioned before, please remember to put up your hand if you want to speak, and feel free to type into the chat box rather. And at the end of the session, I would like to run a short survey, at which time some question and answer sessions can be ongoing as well. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Melanie, who will take us through.
Thank you. And thank you all very much for coming here and sort of being involved in the session today. It's great. I have to start off with a bit of a small disclaimer. You can see at the top left-hand side there's the potential for video, and normally what I would do is I would show a short video of myself sitting here going hello. I actually have a face. I'm not just a discombobulated voice, but unfortunately I've been really crook, and I'm in no fit state for anybody to look at me at all. So you're just going to have to put up with that static picture, I'm afraid. Look, welcome screen. All right. Just quickly, just to let you know, I like to run a very heavily discussion-based session. So if at any time you want to pop your hand up, please pop your hand up. Love to hear what you've got to say. Also use the chat. If, as I'm talking, there's any additional resources and whatnot you'd like to put up, please, pop them in the text chat. It's always weird doing an online session because in a face-to-face session, you normally act as the, the flight attendant and say, please, your exits are behind you. So I always start off with an online session by getting you to remind yourself where the emergency exits in your current facility are. For me, at home, in bed, my emergency exit is, down the stairs and through the front door. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take you through a little bit about what's happening across the VET sector within, sort of in this e-assessment space. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some background research that was done about the standards, the e-assessment standards for the VET sector that are currently available. I'm also going to give you some examples of what's happening using different forms of technology for evidence gathering. I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about what it seems like VET sector people are doing when it comes to authenticity, and I'm also going to give you some, just some thoughts and some observations. So I want to ask quickly, just so I can get a bit of an idea, just with the tick, just by way of ticks, are there any who are researchers? I'm going to ask you where you're from in a couple of minutes, just by way of ticks. Who's a researcher here? Not very many researchers. That's cool, because basically what I was going to say, Nick, researcher, awesome. What I'm going to tell you is that the presentation I'm doing today is based on other people's research, and at the end, when I give you my thoughts and perspectives on things that I've seen, that's not from a strictly speaking a research case. It's more like a reflection in action kind of a case. So I just wanted you to keep that in mind, that I don't have methodologies and I don't have interview numbers and that sort of thing. Okie dokie. So just going to get started with a bit of a poll. So just give this a second because Matt's going to flick our ticks over to A's, B's and C's. What I'm going to ask is just to get a bit of a feel for where everybody's from. How many people are from VET, higher ed, and then other? So if I could get you to select A if you're from VET, B if you're from higher ed, and C if you're from that very, very broad area of other. And I can see lots of A's and B's happening with a few C's. That's let's go ahead and publish that poll and see what it looks like. Looks like we've got a majority of people, slight majority of people from higher ed, and then we've got, look at that, beautiful. We've got 5 people from VET, 7 from higher ed, C, and 3 people from C. Excellent. So for those of you who aren't from the VET sector, in the VET sector we have a slightly different approach to assessment. Being the VET sector, we when VET organisations and RTOs are assessing, we're looking at competency-based assessment, which is basically about confirming that somebody can do the job to a particular standard. So that context makes the VET sector slightly different to the higher ed and secondary contexts. And so when we look at the sort of level of penetration of e-assessment across the VET sector, on the first look, it looks like e-assessment is starting to gain traction across the VET sector. So we've got from 2009 survey results, 46% of RTOs using e-assessment and 62% of teachers and trainers using online assessment activities. One of the issues that I have with these results is that I think that this actually it doesn't really show the depth to which people are using e-assessment across the sector. Because when I talk to people, when I talk about e-assessment, a lot of people think I'm talking about an online quiz. So I guess that whenever we look at statistics, we've got to look at the definition of the thing that we're gathering statistics on. So in terms of defining e-assessment, the VET sector define e-assessment as the range of activities where digital technologies are used in the assessment process. Now, within the e-assessment guidelines for the VET sector, it's very clear that e-assessment is not just about the gathering evidence. It's not just about the gathering evidence stage. It's also about the whole the overall assessment process. So we've got somebody just a clarification on language and words and stuff. Are RTOs government sponsored or commercial? Both. So Mike's sort of asking, is there a significant differential between them? What has traditionally happened is that TAFEs have been government funded or publicly funded, and so you have a split between TAFEs and private or alternative RTOs. What's happening across South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales and the other sectors, the other jurisdictions as well, is that government funding is being funneled not just through TAFE anymore, but through other RTOs. So the VET sector is often called the TAFE sector, which is actually completely incorrect because TAFEs only make up a small percentage of the number of training organisations that are out there. So when we're looking at the overall assessment process, what we're talking about is not just about we're not just talking about the evidence gathering stage, we're talking about the overall assessment process. So when I'll just go back to that slide, so when we look and say 46% of RTOs are using e-assessment, e-learning for assessment, and then we go to this definition of assessment, I think that I would be very surprised if only 46% of the RTOs are using paper-based student management systems. So when you look at what people think is happening across the VET sector, which it looks like e-assessment is not the dominant form of assessment, and then you look at the definition of assessment, what you come to find is that e-assessment methodologies are actually the dominant form of assessment across the VET sector. So for that reason, in a VET context, I don't really like the word e-assessment, because I think that what we should be doing is talking about how we can use technology within the assessment process. And while we talk about e-assessment across the VET sector, we have a situation where practitioners and assessors are thinking one thing and auditors are thinking another thing, and we're not really actually having open dialogue about how technology can facilitate the assessment process. the Australian, it's now called the National Vet e-learning strategy, but it used to be called the Australian Flexible Learning Framework. So a main piece of research around e-assessment came out in 2009. Now, this piece of research is a couple of years old now, and it's I think there's been some changes across the vet sector since this research was released. It was done by Victor Callan and Berwin Clayton, and it started off from the position of is there a bit of a divide between practitioners and assessors and auditors when it comes to e-assessment? And when that piece of research was done, Victor and Berwin identified that there was a bit of a lack of diversity in evidence collection. So at the time, in 2009, the online quiz was the dominant form of e-assessment methodology for evidence gathering. It was not just the dominant form, it was basically, when they did their surveys, it was, we're talking about 96% people who report doing e-assessment were reporting using the online quiz. So it was by far and away the largest type of evidence gathering technique when it came to using e-assessment methodologies and using technologies. From what I've seen and talked to people in the last 3 years, that is now not the case. The different types of ways of gathering evidence are so broad that while the online quiz tends to be in people's mind as what e-assessment is, the reality that's not actually the case. The next point that Victor and Berwin identified was that they've got a lovely phrase for this. As it always happens with a piece of research, sometimes you just get these superb phrases that stick in your head. What they talked about was that sometimes auditors are a little bit more wedded to paper-based methods than they should be. So yes, when it comes to e-assessment methodologies, auditors can often be a little bit resistant and reserved when it comes to doing their auditing when these methodologies are used. On the other hand, though, if you're looking at the online quiz as being, as it was, the dominant form of e-assessment methodology in the past, what they found was that some online quizzes do lack validity. So in a vet context, validity is about, does the assessment assess what it's supposed to assess? And then on the other end, does the assessment, has the assessment assessed what it's supposed to assess? And so where an online quiz is used for the same class, term after term, that assessment can lack validity. The phrase that they use with respect to validity is sometimes assessors can have a set and forget mentality when it comes to the online quiz. So I think that presents a really, that provides a bit of a background as to what was happening in 2009. The other issue that they raised was the issue of authenticity. Now, what I've seen, and as I mentioned earlier, I haven't done any research to back this up, this is just talking to lots of people about e-assessment, is that when it comes to things like authenticity, a lot of auditors have the issue of authenticity in their mind. And in the vet sector, we have a definition of authenticity that the person that is doing the assessment is the person that's getting the award. And that's the basic definition of authenticity in the vet sector. So I think what I've seen is that some of the issues that Victor and Berwin raised in 2009 are becoming more design features when people are designing their assessment processes. But as a piece of research does, it identifies where we have gaps and opportunities for the future. One of the gaps that these guys identified was that we needed a set of standards for the vet sector. So in 2011, the Australian Flexible Learning Framework funded a guy called Rob Stoll and a guy called Reece Lamshed to write, to do a lot of consultation and write basically guidelines for the vet sector to basically to support the rise and the increase of e-assessment. The e-assessment guidelines that were released last year were divided into 5 different areas. And when these e-assessment guidelines were written, there wasn't much new that came into the guidelines. Rather, the guidelines were I want to say cobbled together, but it's not the right word. They were basically aggregated from the existing standards that sit across the vet sector. So the first set of guidelines is around, the infrastructure provisions. So when you're using the assessment technologies, what do you need to have as the RTO and as the assessor? What can you expect that your students have? And so for all the information around the infrastructure, we went to what was then called the e-standards section of the Australian Flexible Learning Framework, what is now called the New Generation Technologies for Learning, part of the VET e-learning strategy. All of the references that I'm referring to I've got at the end of these slides, so you don't have to be frantically taking notes. The second point is around what are some of the technical standards that you need to consider. So in terms of technical standards, we're looking at things like portability through and across learning management systems. We're looking at file formats, and I'll give you an example of technical standards in action. I worked on an NBN funded project, a project that looked at utilising the NBN, and what the RTO thought was, this is great. Instead of sending low def pictures, images across the internet, we can send high def images and video. And so when they were working in the low definition space, the file formats were quite easy. They were all JPEGs and PNGs and whatnot. As soon as they asked students to start working with high-def video, the file formats changed. Generally, high-def video was taken with proprietary file formats, which meant that the students actually had to go through a lot of other steps to get that video via the NBN back to their RTO. So that's an example of sort of the technical standards.
Looks like we might have lost Melanie there for a while. We'll see just wait a bit and see if we can get her back. She probably needs to, there we go, she's logged in. Hello, Melanie.
Hey, I'm so sorry about that. I dropped out for a second.
Yeah, hang on, I need to give you...
Hey, Matthew, I'm back. Again. I'm sorry.
Yep, moderator privileges thing. Okay. Hopefully you should have control again.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Away you go.
Okay. So where were we? We're looking at the development and maintenance. So when it comes to the vet sector, we've got the standards that RTOs work to are the standards for MVR registered training organisations. They used to be called the AQTF, and so basically the third set refers to how, just the fact that RTOs need to adhere to particular standards. When it comes to e-assessment practices, these standards are about helping RTOs to understand the different practices that they need to consider when looking at e-assessment technologies. And then finally, context. And one of the things that's raised here is the fact that e-assessment really needs to be pulled into an organisational context, and it's not just individual assessments running here and there. So that's a bit of a broad overview of the guidelines as they stand at the moment for the vet sector. Feedback that I get from the guidelines is they're a very good what document. They're what you need to know, what you need to do, but they're not a particularly good how document because they don't tell you how to do it. They don't tell you how to keep auditors happy. They don't tell you, how exactly to do these things. So that's within that kind of context. At the end of last year, the Queensland Vet Development Centre, the QVDC, started putting some workshops together around e-assessment. And what the QVDC people did was they looked at they looked at the different forms of evidence collection. So what I'm going to do now is, previously I've been talking broadly about the e-assessment process. So that's the overall assessment process. What I'm going to start doing now is talking about the forms of evidence collection. Now, Matthew's popped in the text chat when we're talking about how broad the guidelines are and focusing on the what to do, not how to do it. He's raised the issue. It's not actually a bad thing because technology changes so fast, which is so very, very true. So what sort of ways are, and Melanie's put in there a comment, the principles of how to use them are pretty constant, yeah. So looking at the different forms of evidence collection across the vet sector, what Queensland Vet Development Centre did was they identified these kind of primary ways that evidence is that evidence is collected. So using text-based evidence, using visual evidence, audio, simulations, and peer assessment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through some examples of how these different forms of evidence collection are being used across the vet sector. Now, I know I've been talking very quickly, except for when I dropped out. At this point, if you've got any examples of how you know people are using evidence, different forms of evidence collection, please pop up your hand or put it in the text chat because I'm really interested in what other people are doing. So in terms of text-based evidence, quizzes are still quite a dominant form of assessment across the vet sector. Important to note, though, that when it comes to quizzes, what people are starting to do is not just use a simple, is Matthew wearing a red shirt, B blue shirt, C green shirt? They're not using simple forms of quizzes. They're starting to use quizzes within learning management systems that can provide branching and then explore different components of that learning, so adaptive quizzes. The SMSs, so using SMSs to collect evidence from students. So that might be about asking the student as they do something at work to take a photo of it and SMS it or MMS it back, or as a student does something in their work placement to send an SMS message back to the assessor, so that's recorded at that point in time. Similarly with instant messaging, so using instant messaging like Skype or within chat facilities within a learning management system is being used for assessment, and so is discussion forums. When it comes to assessment using discussion forums, what assessors are doing is being really clear and quantifying the assessment, being really clear and quantifying what does the assessment look like when the student is participating in a discussion forum. What I don't have there around text-based evidence is the simple and humble Word document. Now, I know that seems like a really low-tech example of collecting evidence, but there was an RTO in Queensland, the Scripture Union, and they experimented with e-portfolios. They experimented with PDFs that students could put their information into and attach, other forms of evidence attached along with the PDF. And it never really got great traction. And when they moved back to this humble Word document, what they found was that so this is more about formative assessment, Mike. When I'm talking about assessment, this can be either formative or summative assessment. With the Scripture Union, what they found was that with their students are using Word documents all the time. And when they had something that was about the student in the learning management system, the students weren't necessarily connecting with that because a lot of their work is done in the workplace. So when they moved to a Word document, as low-tech as that may seem, they actually got better student outcomes than when they used some other forms other forms of evidence collection. I'm also starting to hear, when it comes to text-based evidence, also starting to hear about people experimenting with the use of Twitter. And that sort of, I don't know of anybody who's actually assessing in that way yet. That seems to be more about a delivery strategy. In terms of the collection of visual evidence, this kind of overlaps a little bit with audio evidence, but in terms of visual evidence, people are using videos and cameras, camera phones. I'm not allowed to call them point of view glasses, but glasses that can be attached to headsets and eye goggles and whatnot that actually take the point of view of the student as they're doing a piece of work. When it comes to authenticity, the great thing about using video and image-based evidence is that students can take a picture of themselves as they're actually doing it. An example of how visual evidence is being used, Tracy Reagan from Wide Bay TAFE is using it with her water industry students. So what happens is, for example, the student might have to take a photo of where they have taken a water sample. So they can take a photo of the water sampling kit that they use, and they can take a photo of where they are and where they've taken the water sample from. That can get, either emailed back or put in an e-portfolio. And then what happens is the assessor is able to have conversation and discussion with the student about that evidence. So what that means is that even if the student wasn't there, even if the student has used somebody else's photos, they're still questioned on the processes that they used. So it means that you're pulling in an additional piece of an assessment that sits around that visual evidence collection. I can see that, Mike, you've popped in the text chat that the biggest problem is convincing verification around the summative evidence. Yeah. And so when it comes to visual evidence, what people are doing is having their students take where it's video. The student takes a video of themselves saying, "Hi, this is me doing, whatnot." The other way that that assessors are sort of getting that, that double check that the student who's taking that photo is they're using the geotags. They're using geotags to have a look at where the image actually came from. When it comes to images, they're also doing things like doing a Google search for images, Google image search, to make sure that it was the student who actually took that photo. So an example of that is within I think it's TAFE New South Wales, their hairdressing students develop an e-portfolio as a part of their on-job work, and there was a student whose photos of an up style, like as in going out and having your hair done up, ladies' hair done up. There was a student who their up style indicated a level of competence that had previously not been demonstrated. And so what the assessor did was they looked at that very, very high quality up style. They did a search to make sure that there were no Google images, there were no images on the internet. And after doing that, they found that there were no other images, so the student hadn't just taken it from the internet. They contacted the student's supervisor on their work placement to confirm that it was the student's work. So what I'm seeing is, like I said, this is not from a research base, this is from just having conversations with people. What I'm seeing is that when assessors are looking at the different levels of evidence, they're also they're looking at ways that they can sort of authenticate the student. They're looking at the authenticity of the student in different ways depending on the type of evidence that's being collected. In terms of the collection of audio evidence, what we're seeing is that people are starting, as the collection of audio evidence is becoming so much easier. So even a couple of years ago, you'd have to go out and buy, an MP3 player, MP3 recorder. These days, most smartphones have an inbuilt audio recorder, and it's really easy to get those files off of. It's really easy to get the files off of phones and other devices. So we're actually seeing a bit of a rise in the use of audio evidence. An example of using audio evidence can also be seen in the different plugins that organisations are coupling with their learning management system. There's a couple that fit nicely with Moodle, and what allows the assessor to do is, rather than having the students type into an answer, they can record their voice. So I can give you an example of this in children's services. In children's services, there's the changing context, regulatory context of children's services means that an auditor in the children's services environment, a quality auditor, can walk onto any childcare centre and ask any person at any time any questions about how that centre runs. So what this means is that in the past, children's services assessments used to be quite paper-based because students didn't have to, they need to be able to talk, but students didn't need to be able to respond quickly to questions in this context. So what a Queensland Children's Services group of people are doing is, rather than having a question, sort of a quiz in a learning management system where the student types in a short answer, they actually have an audio file that the student has to listen to, and then rather than typing their answer into the editor, there's an audio plug-in that the student responds back saying, sort of talking through their response. And then, of course, the assessor can listen to that and do the assessment. One of the challenges for the vet sector, though, is that in some contexts, the length of time between saying something, like a customer saying something and a person responding, the length of time in response can be critical for the assessment process. So the Brisbane North Institute of TAFE received funding at the beginning of this year from the National Vet E-Learning Strategy to develop a little flash-based tool. And what the tool allows the student to do is the student hears a customer complaint. So it might be a customer complaint of somebody saying, "I'm a vegetarian, why did you bring me a beef curry? I can't eat this." As soon as the person on the screen stops talking, as soon as that video stops, the audio starts to be recorded. So when the student responds, it's not just the student's response that's recorded, it's also the gap between the end of the complaint or the end of the person talking and the beginning of the student, the student's response to that complaint. And so that's an example of where audio is being used to not just measure the quality of what's being said, but also the length of time, response time. When it comes to simulations being used in the vet sector can range from the really sophisticated to quite simple. In terms of sophisticated, you've got the Australian Army have a simulator that allows them to, people who are learning to use Black Hawk helicopters, there's a vet qualification that wraps around being a part of Black Hawk helicopter, which is around the communication skills they need to be able to have, communicating with the tower, landing a helicopter in, in conflict zones, that sort of thing. So the Army have a simulator that wraps around the Black Hawk helicopter skills that allows them to, assess how the pilot is speaking to ground control and vice versa. So that's a very sophisticated example, and it's a relatively new example as well. What the Army used to do, and I think this is absolutely classic, is they used to have the Black Hawk helicopter sitting in a Tarago van with all of the doors and windows blacked out, with just a headset talking to, talking to people, basically driving the van backwards to park it in a field in the middle of nowhere. So that's an example of sort of a very sophisticated to a quite a simple simulation. Another example of quite a sophisticated simulation is that the Australian Dive Accreditation Centre have developed a very sophisticated way of assessing dive supervisors. So a dive supervisor is the person that's on a boat that's basically supervising 2 or 3 commercial divers deep underwater. So their very sophisticated simulation allows them to do things like pump the office full of smoke to see how the dive supervisor would cope in that particular environment. So they're able to, in this particular context, normally a dive supervisor needs 200 hours of supervised time, and the national bodies have actually decreased that by 30% if people have been trained and assessed on this dive simulator. In terms of simple simulations, what a lot of people are using is they're just using Skype. One of the great things about using Skype for simulating work environments and simulating role plays is that you're able to record it, so the assessor can play it back later. It's a relatively familiar technology. It's so similar to making a telephone call that people are quite comfortable with that, and they can also incorporate video into that evidence collection. Finally, peer assessment, and this is one of the areas where there isn't a lot of peer assessment happening across the vet sector, especially in the summative case. And one of the reasons for that is that across the vet sector we have a rule that says the only person that can assess somebody is somebody with the training and assessment competencies. So all of a sudden we're in a situation that, unlike higher ed, where you can give students a rubric and get them to assess each other, within the vet sector we're not able to do that, especially in the high stakes summative context. So we don't see a lot of peer assessment occurring across the vet sector. I ran a project at the beginning of the year with ASC Training and Development here in Adelaide, and what we did was we explored using a workshop module of Moodle to do peer assessment. And what we found, and the director at ASC Training and Development has a beautiful phrase for it, what we found was that the students tended to have a greater level of forensic clarity around the expectations of their assessment process, because they knew that they were assessing they knew that they were assessing other students. So they tended to have a greater understanding of what was actually expected in their assessment process. So that's some examples of different ways that different evidence that's being collected across the vet sector. And what I'd like to do is just tell you a bit of a story about how something that started as a bit of a cool thing has changed a little bit. So the Skills Tasmania developed an app called the IQTI Player. And it's a free app that's available for iPhones only, unfortunately. And what the IQTI Player allows you to do is you go onto a web page, you take your assessment tool, you plunk it into the web page, and then it spits it out the file format that talks to the IQTI app. It means that when an assessor goes to a site, rather than standing there with a big clunky assessment tool and a folder and a pen, what the assessor is able to do is just stand there with the phone and take photos of the student and ask the student questions and pop the responses and whatnot into this iPhone app. At the end of the day, that information is packaged up, it's zipped up, and you can email it to yourself. So in terms of the overall assessment process, the assessment process isn't any different using that technology than it is standing there with a folder. But what the students said is, that when a lecturer stands there with a big ass folder, they get really nervous because they're not used to people standing around giving them that kind of surveillance. However, when the lecturer stands there with the iPhone, they're used to people standing around with iPhones, texting and whatnot. So they felt a lot more comfortable with the technology. From the assessor's perspective, it took about the same length of time as, more traditional ways of gathering that evidence. But at the back end, because they were able to sift all that information up and then export it into their student management system or their learning management system, it saved them about 50% extra time at the back end kind of, doing things. So when this IQTI player came out, I thought, oh, this is brilliant. Who wouldn't use this? And I was I was doing this and I was telling people about this IQTI player, and this woman said, oh, you want to have a look at what we're doing with our iPads? And with their iPads, they were just taking a simple PDF form, converting it into an editable PDF, so you can, type information in the fields, add different files and whatnot, attach them to the PDF. They were still able to export it and email it to themselves, and they were getting, very similar outcomes to this very, heavily resourced app. So the reason why I told you that story is just to, keep in the back of our minds that it doesn't, across the vet sector, it doesn't necessarily have to be the highfalutin, crazy examples. Sometimes simple is often the best. So what am I seeing around authenticity? There are some really cool ways of assuring authenticity. I mean, people are doing things like using the geotags. There are examples of people using the thumb, a USB drive with a thumbprint, so biometric scanning sort of things. There's examples or statements that students have to sign before they can go on to quizzes and that sort of thing. But the bottom line is that what I'm finding is that the two components of ensuring authenticity is that people build a relationship with the learner. They have a relationship with that learner and they get to learn the student voice. And it doesn't matter whether you're hearing the student voice or you're seeing what the student's writing or you're seeing that assessment over a period of time, they're getting a picture of what the student can do, and that's assisting them to work out whether the student's introducing a third party into the assessment process. Second thing is it's about gathering evidence over time. So when assessors are gathering evidence over a period of time, they're able to see that student's development and see that student's growth. So once again, if they're introducing a third party into the assessment process, that's clearly visible. The third way is around asking focused questions. So what often happens as a part of the assessment process is once the student provides a piece of evidence, when the assessor asks focused questions, this assists to be able to sort of identify whether it's actually the student who's done the work or not. Now, Mike has asked about the iPad app. I'm not going to remember off the top of my head. There's a couple of iPad apps and Android apps that allow you to edit PDFs. I think there's one called PDF Expert. Thanks, Melanie Dorian. PDF Expert, it's about $10, I think, and it allows you to edit an interactive PDF. So from the desktop side of things, you need to have, a PDF Professional, I think it's called, and it's not a dedicated vet app. It's just a general app that's been appropriated in an educational context. Okay, so I know we're getting to the end of the time, and I'd love to be able to, sort of do some discussion and questions and whatnot. As I mentioned earlier, this is not from a research base. This is from, just talking to people. What I'm finding is that there is a bit of an assumption by decision makers that people who are using technology in assessment kind of wake up one day and think, oh, I've got this great thing I've got this great tool, I'm going to use it in my assessment process. The reality is, and Melanie Dorian's just put up in the text chat that it's, when you're looking at apps, it's about how apps can be applied to the assessment and evidence gathering process, which is a really good point, Mel. So when it comes to the vet sector, what I'm seeing is that a lot of vet practitioners are, when it comes to the delivery, they're being really experimental in the way that they use technology. But when it comes to the assessment process, they tend to use the tried and true tested methods in an assessment process. So even when you've got a practitioner who's being really innovative in their delivery, their assessment being, the high risk type of environment, they're being a lot more circumspect about the assessment methodologies that they use, the assessment tools that they use. When it comes to assessment for learning, what's happening across the vet sector is we're starting to see people not just doing formative and summative assessment. We're seeing assessment being bound in the delivery process. When it comes to the issue of cheating and the fears and realities of that, what we're seeing about like the fears and realities of whether somebody's got a third party assisting them in the assessment process. What I'm seeing is that lecturers are starting to be clever about the different ways that they're asking for evidence. So for example, having a really good understanding of what it is that you're assessing and what it is that the student needs to provide. So I'll give you an example of a visual merchandising in the retail context. So in retail, visual merchandising is about how you can make in the supermarket those ends that are filled with stock, how you make that look good. It's also about how window displays look. It's quite an important component of retail management. And an assessor said to me once, I had a student, they emailed me this report and they said, I didn't get time to do the display myself, but what I did was I asked somebody else to do the display, and then I told them to do this and this and this. And he said, is that okay? Is that, should I be able to accept that? And my response was, what are you actually assessing here? If you're assessing the student's ability to be able to do the manual handling and the physical putting things together, then that doesn't hit the mark for a student assessment. But if you're assessing the student's ability to put together a visual merchandising display, which actually demonstrates good practice, then to me, that is a good form, that is a good assessment, and that is a valid assessment for that student. My final thoughts are around peer assessment. That I think that we're going to see a growth of peer assessment in the vet sector. The opportunities afforded by peer assessment are huge, and we've seen that a lot. Higher ed has used peer assessment a lot within their assessment processes, and I hope that we'll start to see that more across the vet sector. So that's I've got some resources there, and Matt, I'm happy to make those resources available for everybody to be able to get access to. And I know I'm really cutting it fine. We've got 5 minutes left. Does anybody have any comments or questions or points to make? No? It's like crickets here. Everyone's so quiet. I can see a couple of you writing in the text chat. If you've got anything else that you'd like to, any comments or anything that you would like to comments or examples of how assessment's being used in the vet sector, if I've missed anything out, please just say.
While people are thinking,
and if I don't have anything, Matthew, I'll pass on to you.
Yep, that's okay. Whilst people please continue with their question and answer, I want to put up a slide that points to the feedback for our webinar series. So if people, whilst they're thinking about the Q&A or discussing, the same time, if you click that link, it should appear in your web browser, I hope. And that may or may not be behind the webinar window, so just check to see where that comes out. I can, whoops. So in the meantime, please continue. Just sort of commenting on Melanie Dorian's comment there about interesting to see how it could be applied in higher education. In terms of e-assessment, it is coming on quite strongly, but in terms of things like guidelines, very little, to be honest. The vet sector is way ahead of higher education. We've seen in terms of establishing guidelines and what have you. And from what I've sort of found around the place, even at the institutional level, policies regarding how guidelines for its use is also quite rare. There are guidelines for things like e-exams, but normally they come in the form of proctored exams using computer labs and things. And the guidelines, I've had a hunt around on the internet, and basically the only ones I've managed to find are actually in the UK. And a lot of that came out of, I think, the JISC, or Joint Information Systems Committee they're called, in the UK. We've also got information on the e-assessment and guidelines and all of these kinds of things. So the UK is a bit ahead in that department as well.
Up on what you were talking about with the JISC guidelines, when the vet guidelines were put together, that was definitely a part of the research that was done, and looking at what JISC had done and how their guidelines were structured were instrumental in how the guidelines were sort of put together in Australia. And I think that when it comes to the vet sector, because we have such significant guidelines around the standards for NBR registered training organisations and issues of assess the principles of assessment and rules of evidence, that had to be that was quite critical that those things were included within vet guidelines.
Does anybody know of any projects that are currently going on? Sorry, currently going on in the higher ed sector about developing guidelines? If anybody's heard about any projects, or particularly within the institutional context, I think developing guidelines across the higher ed education sector is going to be a lot less likely, but certainly within institutions, I could see that happening in relatively short order.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much for having me. I'll put my email in the text chat so that if anybody wants to get in touch with me directly, I'm more than happy. I'm more than happy to send any other information that I've got, or take questions offline. So thanks for having me, Matthew. Thanks for having me, guys.
Most welcome. Pleasure to hear about the things happening in the vet sector. Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll wrap it up. I'm going to stop the recording, but if people